Chapter 16, 2014. Andy's DBS, deep brain stimulation surgery, had been successful, but we wouldn't be able to really see results for a couple more months after the swelling of his brain went down, so he could have the stimulator turned on. Andy kept shaking, and life continued much as before, except knowing we had the opportunity to see the benefits of the surgery gave us more hope. Andy was able to be patient. In November 2013, a year after we had attended Davis Finney's Victory Summit and learned about the surgery, we drove to the Albuquerque VA hospital, and Dr. Sarah programmed Andy. The peace of Andy being still again filled us up to the brim. We celebrated this enormous gift by simply carrying on, living our very best lives. It had been 9 years of Andy tremoring. For 7 of those years, his tremor was more of a shake and was completely disabling. Andy could feed himself now. He could shave, cut his toenails, walk, go to the gym, go to the store, talk on the phone, use the computer, make himself an omelet, and hold a book and read it. We received his health with deep humility. Every day we awakened to another day without shaking. I think I can push our beds together again without a risk of you keeping me up from your shaking, I said to Andy, and he smiled. He smiled! He hadn't been able to smile for many years. I felt like I'd won the lottery. The Parkinson's mask was removed. Andy drove with me to Austin for an art show. Sometimes I'd get nervous when he drove because it had been so long since he'd been behind the wheel that he was a bit like a beginner again. The car would veer toward the left on the center line. He didn't ever put us in danger, but he wasn't as steady as he used to be. It turned out that driving, like so many skills, was something Andy needed to relearn. On the very first day of sales in Austin, Andy sat in our booth, but he'd gotten very tired. "Can you sit up instead of slumping?" I asked. Our booth was small, and when he'd slump and close his eyes, it made us look unprofessional. He was no longer adept at making sales, because he had never used a smartphone before. When a lady handed him some jewelry and her credit card, he wrapped up the jewelry and put it in a gift bag, and then handed the credit card to me. This evoked a strange look from the customer. She didn't understand why he didn't just swipe her card. Andy was returning to a world that he hadn't participated in for years. He did understand that he had a lot to learn, and that the art show in full swing was not the place to start. "I'm going to the stage to watch the music," he told me. He walked out of our brightly lit booth into the darkened auditorium, and I kept on selling. The next day, rather than come to the show, he stayed at our host's home and watched a football game, and rested, and just came in for a few hours in the evening. It was all so wonderful to have him there, and yet by the end of the 12 days it was clear that we had a way to go toward integrating Andy back into the world. The confidence that had eroded from Parkinson's disease hadn't returned because of the surgery. "Do you think I'm safe to drive?" he asked me as we started the 800-mile drive home from Austin. "Of course you are," I stated. "Besides, I'm not safe to drive the whole way by myself." As we approached home after 2 days on the road, I swear his driving was much steadier after all the practicing. We began living as well as we could with Andy's new abilities. Roger bought him an iPad for Christmas, and Brendan suggested he get a simple phone called a jitterbug made for older people. By default, I became Andy's instructor for these new devices, and I did my best, but was grateful when Brendan or Alana would visit and do some IT lessons with Andy. He wanted to learn, and that helped. "Why are you talking so softly?" I asked him one day while figuring something out on his iPad. "I'm just talking in my normal way," he spoke in a whisper voice that I could barely hear. I wondered if he had a sore throat. "I'm fine," he whispered emphatically. His voice began to fade more and more. One day I phoned Joanne, his neurology nurse. "What happens in Parkinson's is that the voice becomes softer because the patient perceives they're talking too loudly. The brain can't distinguish yelling from whispering," she told me. "We have therapy for this in a class he could take called Lee Silverman's Voice Treatment, or LSVT Loud. It's a month-long class of 16 sessions and will help him speak louder." "Okay," I said, looking at Andy, who was nodding his head. "Let's sign him up." Andy quickly devolved into whispering all the time. I could never hear him, and it was very hard to understand his words, even when I'd go to him and put my ear to his mouth. I couldn't wait for the LSVT loud classes to begin. "Do you think you're shouting right now?" I asked him one morning when he was mouthing words that nobody was able to hear. He shook his head. "Well, Joanne thinks you think you are shouting because Parkinson's has messed with your perception of volume and made you unable to modulate." I had an inkling of doubt about the classes helping because Andy did not perceive he was talking loudly. He knew he was whispering. I felt déjà vu, reflecting back to all the times we thought we were following the right treatment plan, but actually weren't even identifying the cause of Andy's distress. I tried to keep an open mind about the speech therapy. Still, I wondered, if the diagnosis was wrong, would the remedy help? Andy went through the LSVT Loud program and faithfully did the exercises and homework, to no avail. It did not help him talk. I could see Andy becoming less outgoing and retreating inside himself because having no voice meant less communication and therefore less relationship and connection with the world. I felt hurt when I'd come home and he didn't acknowledge my presence because he had no voice. I suppose he could have jumped up when I walked in and done a little happy dance and smiled or something, but he didn't do that either. I felt ignored. We'd sit in total silence during meals. We'd drive together without speaking. Sometimes we'd have friends over for dinner, and I would be exhausted after cooking, serving, and being in conversation nonstop to make up for Andy's quiet. I became convinced that he just wasn't trying hard enough. I felt annoyed with him. "I sure wish my husband couldn't talk," a friend joked. "No, you don't," I told her. "You don't understand the desperation, loneliness, and isolation of it." We were making plans for another trip to India. It was exciting that Andy would be able to go with us, and this time we'd only be in Ladakh. This trip was foremost about Alana being able to measure the results of a solar project she had implemented, providing lights to some of the poorest and most remote communities in Ladakh. We were going to see all the children we knew there who had returned to their homeland from the school in Dehradun. A filmmaker was joining us to document Alana's project, and Brendan, his girlfriend, and her parents were all joining us. It was a big, fun group traveling halfway around the world. I dove into planning it while Andy immersed himself in LSVT loud classes. He was not encouraged. "I don't think this is helping me to be able to talk," he said. "I feel like my voice is being suppressed somehow, and I can't access it." The word suppress made a light bulb go off in both our brains. "Let's turn off the stimulator and see what happens," he whispered to me. Turning off the stimulator meant that Andy would become an uncontrollable, shaking man. His teeth would chatter, and he'd have to be careful not to bite his tongue as his jaw stiffened. His hands and arms would become unmanageable as they'd slap up and down, and his legs would bounce as if keeping time to horrible music. It was a messy experiment and uncomfortable for Andy. I held our remote up to the battery in his chest, pressed the off button, and all hell broke loose in his body. "I can talk," he said loud and clear. "Turn me back on, please." The deep brain stimulator that had given him his life back had stolen his voice. He stopped those LSVT loud classes. He practiced all the wonderful things he could do now and became much stronger physically, but the quiet continued. In the months after his DBS surgery, Andy weaned himself off all the Parkinson's drugs. His doctor warned that research had shown that a small dose of one of the drugs could be beneficial, but he chose to go without. Being drug-free helped him feel more like himself. He no longer felt sleepy midday or like he had brain fog. Without medical science and surgery, Andy would not have his life back. On every step of our journey, we were confronted with doctors and healers of all persuasions who would not help us because of our insistence on remaining open and not committing exclusively to the protocol they purported. Thankfully, Dr. Sarah and Nurse Joanne approached their own cutting-edge work with open minds. Ladakh and Other Summer Travels, 2014. We made arrangements for 8 of us to travel to Ladakh, and then for me and Andy to continue on to Norway, Sweden, England, and France for another few weeks. We planned this trip together in a way that had not been possible for many years. We arrived into Delhi in the wee hours. Brendan, his girlfriend, and her parents met us, and we all headed to Ladakh. Ladakh was in a joyous celebratory period as the mostly Buddhist section of Jammu and Kashmir was hosting the Dalai Lama at the yearly Kalachakra celebration. Our joy continued and became hilarity when we rode camels in Nubra Valley. Our little group stayed close together, the chain of camels walking along the desert floor. Our laughter increased into full belly laughs as we watched each other, took photos, and accepted the ridiculous grace of camel riding. Every time our laughter started to subside, one of our camels would expel gas loudly, and we'd be forced into another gale of giggles. The exquisite surroundings enhanced the music of our silliness. I recalled that a year before, Andy wasn't able to feed himself or do much of anything. I was grateful that sad memory had absolutely no power to interrupt the hilarity of our present experience. Perhaps we were all a little drunk with oxygen deprivation, because earlier that day we'd driven over a pass more than 18,000 feet above sea level. The extreme height might have increased our susceptibility to goofy outbreaks, but I knew that wherever they came from, it was a gift to laugh out the suffering we had held for so long. A camel ride was just the right antidote for the release of the past trauma and into the beginning of the rest of Andy's life with Parkinson's quelled. A few days later, we took a long drive to another region of Ladakh, and our group stayed at a tent camp. We were preparing for a very arduous hike to a spiritual site high in the mountains. This was going to be the most challenging physical test that Andy had chosen since his brain surgery a bit less than a year before. All of us, but particularly Brendan, helped Andy maneuver over rocks and rickety ladders across streams in a narrow slot canyon. Andy handled it all well, and along the highest razor ridge, he chose to run the last steps to the monastery wall. The size of this place was hard to comprehend. We all stood together in the rugged Himalayan mountains that rippled for us as far as we could see. While the others explored caves where holy monks had meditated, I stayed with Andy in a sunny spot, and he slept. On the way down, things became hard. Andy's body lost much of its ability to coordinate movement, and his posture changed into an odd shape, leaning back with his hips thrust forward and his legs awkwardly kicking. He leaned over to one side as if his back wouldn't hold him straight. It was exhausting to both lift him upright and be his brakes for many miles. I could see Andy felt discouraged from needing such abundant assistance again. The next morning, Andy awakened and was fully able to control his movement and walk normally. This was our first, but not last, experience learning that the brain implants had limitations after extreme exertion.